Daniel never truly feared his stepson Evan, until the night he found Lisa dead at the bottom of the stairs. What began as a strained family dynamic quickly spiraled into a chilling tale of manipulation, hidden crimes, and a quiet war fought under one roof. Evan wasn't just troubled, he was dangerous. And by the time Daniel realized it, it was already too late to stop what was coming. Everything about Daniel Harper seemed perfectly normal, almost forgettably so. He was the kind of man whose presence was more noticeable in absence, the kind you might remember for his punctuality, or the way he always brought lemon cake to office potlucks. He worked as a bookkeeper at a small accounting firm in a quiet Oregon town where nothing ever seemed to change. The same neighbors mowed their lawns every Sunday, the same clerks rang up groceries at the local store, and the same wind chimes tapped gently on every porch. Daniel lived in a modest two-story house with his wife Lisa and her teenage son Evan. Lisa had lost her first husband in a boating accident on the Columbia River 7 years earlier. It had been tragic and sudden, leaving her to raise Evan on her own for several years. Then came Daniel, steady, soft-spoken, and responsible. He filled a quiet gap in both their lives. He didn't try to replace Evan's father. He was just there. Solid. Evan had been 12 when Daniel married Lisa. At first, the boy seemed indifferent. He never acted out or rebelled, but there was always a chill beneath the surface. A polite distance. Over time, that frostiness melted into quiet tolerance. Daniel made an effort, attending parent-teacher nights, cheering at soccer games, even helping Evan prep for the SATs. Evan didn't exactly bond with him, but he didn't push him away either. By the time Evan left for college, the house had finally settled into something resembling peace. Lisa worked part-time at a veterinary clinic and spent her evenings gardening. Daniel buried himself in tax forms and spreadsheets. On weekends, they watched old crime dramas and made waffles. Life was quiet, comfortable, and most importantly, predictable. But comfort has a way of numbing instincts. And predictability is sometimes just the space between the waves. Evan came home for the summer after his freshman year, and that's when things began to shift. At first, it was subtle. Daniel noticed his watch missing from the bathroom counter one morning. A few days later, he found it under the couch, something Evan insisted he hadn't seen. Then, Lisa's earrings vanished. She assumed she had misplaced them. Next, Daniel's wallet turned up in the laundry basket, missing $60. Lisa said maybe he'd left it in his pants pocket. Daniel brushed it off. Everyone forgets things, right? But something inside him, a small persistent itch, refused to settle. He began paying closer attention. Whenever money disappeared, Evan had been home. When strange Amazon packages arrived, Evan was the one who took them inside. They were never addressed to anyone in the house, just initials and random names, but Evan always said they were returns he was handling for friends. Daniel didn't want to accuse him. After all, what proof did he have? Evan was Lisa's only son. She doted on him, defended him, and saw no wrong in him. To bring suspicion into their home felt like betrayal. Still, the coincidences piled up. Daniel started keeping a notebook. Just small things, dates, amounts, items. He didn't know what he was hoping to find, but he wanted a pattern. He wanted certainty. He began testing Evan in subtle ways, leaving small bills out on the counter, locking drawers to see if someone would tamper with them, marking the corners of envelopes with pencil dots. Within 3 weeks, he had more than enough to be concerned. $120 gone from a locked drawer. A pencil-marked envelope opened and resealed. Packages arriving daily, often in Evan's name or variations of it. E. Harper, Evan H., even an Edward Hale. Daniel still didn't confront him. Instead, he began searching Evan's room when everyone was out. He hated himself for it, crossing a boundary he swore he wouldn't. But curiosity had turned to dread. One quiet Wednesday morning, he found something that confirmed his worst fears. Beneath a loose board in the closet floor, hidden under a towel, were 3 driver's licenses, all with Evan's photo and different names. Alongside them sat a burner phone, a wad of cash, and a black notebook filled with numbers, account details, and what looked like transaction logs. Daniel froze. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. This wasn't just a rebellious teen selling junk online. This was criminal. Real, dangerous criminal activity. Identity theft. Fraud. Maybe more. He took the notebook and drove to the edge of town. He sat in his car for nearly an hour, debating what to do. Call the police? Tell Lisa? But how could he explain why he'd been rifling through her son's room? How could he justify not seeing the signs earlier? In the end, he made the worst choice of all. He destroyed it. He burned the notebook and buried the fake IDs. He erased the evidence and, with it, any hope of distancing himself from what would follow. That night, Daniel sat at the dinner table with Lisa and Evan. They ate lasagna and talked about a new Netflix show. Evan laughed more than usual. Daniel just nodded along, his stomach churning. He had made his choice, and he didn't know it yet, but Evan had seen everything. Daniel could no longer pretend. After what he'd found in Evan's room, the IDs, the burner phone, the ledger full of financial records, it was impossible to see his stepson the same way. Every movement, every word from Evan now had a shadow behind it. He watched the boy laugh with Lisa, pet the dog, load the dishwasher, and wondered how much of it was performance. It became harder to tell where the teenager ended and the con artist began. But Daniel didn't tell Lisa. He couldn't. Her health had been fragile in recent years, a string of minor issues that had worn her down little by little. Migraines, insomnia, dizzy spells. She clung to routine and to the small comforts of family. Daniel feared what the truth would do to her. So he said nothing. He told himself it was temporary. Maybe Evan would stop. Maybe it had all been some misguided experiment, a way to feel powerful, to test the limits of deception. Daniel tried to believe that. He wanted to believe it. But Evan didn't stop. He just changed the rules. After the evidence had been burned and the ledger destroyed, Evan's behavior shifted. He no longer tried to hide things. Boxes arrived in broad daylight, stacked 3 high on the porch. Daniel opened one once when no one was home. Inside were dozens of prepaid debit cards, all still in their packaging. Another box held 10 USB drives and SIM cards. He didn't know what they were for, but he knew it couldn't be anything good. He placed everything back and resealed the tape. Evan began using the basement more. He said he needed space to work out, to set up his gaming gear. Lisa was thrilled. Her son was finally getting into a routine. Daniel knew better. He could hear the clicks of a keyboard echoing through the vents late into the night, the hum of multiple devices running at once. Sometimes Evan didn't come up until morning. He looked pale and wired, eyes darting and lips curled into a knowing smirk that Daniel couldn't unsee. Curiosity turned into fear when Daniel received an anonymous email. It had no message, just a photo, taken from inside the house. It showed Daniel holding the burner phone he'd found in Evan's room. The angle was clear. Someone had been watching. Daniel deleted it immediately, but the message had already landed. Evan knew. He knew Daniel had seen the truth, and he was warning him. It wasn't long after that Lisa started acting strange. She seemed tired, more forgetful than usual. She'd lose her train of thought mid-sentence, or go to the kitchen and forget why she was there. She once drove to the grocery store and called Daniel from the parking lot, unsure how she got there. The doctor chalked it up to stress, maybe early menopause. "Nothing serious," he said. But Daniel started to wonder. Lisa took a multivitamin every morning with her coffee, one that Evan had been buying for her online. She'd once mentioned that Evan found it cheaper on some specialty site. Daniel checked the label. Everything looked normal. But what if it wasn't? He poured a few out and examined them closely. Hard to tell. What does poison even look like when it's slow, when it's subtle? Still, he didn't act. Maybe he didn't want to know. Maybe part of him hoped he was being paranoid. Or maybe he was just too deep in it now, too entangled in the lie he'd chosen when he destroyed the original evidence. Any move against Evan would open the door to questions Daniel wasn't ready to answer. Then one night Daniel went into the basement. He waited until Evan was out with friends, and Lisa was asleep. The room was pitch black, but once he flipped the switch, the truth came flooding in. There were 3 monitors, all glowing with data. Transactions, spreadsheets, usernames, login credentials. On one screen was a live stream of their own front porch camera. Another showed a messaging app full of usernames and phrases Daniel didn't understand. One message blinked at the top. All cleared, waiting for next batch. In the corner sat a locked cabinet. Daniel found the key taped beneath the desk. Inside were more IDs, this time with high-resolution photos, barcodes, watermarks. These weren't just forgeries. They were nearly perfect. There were also stacks of documents, bank forms, tax returns, letters from the IRS, all fakes, but terrifyingly convincing. Daniel realized this wasn't a game. This wasn't a phase. Evan was running something organized, something layered and dangerous, and he wasn't working alone. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He stayed in the living room with the lights off, listening for any sound upstairs. When Evan finally returned, close to 2 a.m., he went straight to the kitchen, opened the fridge, poured himself a drink, and looked toward the living room. Daniel held his breath. Evan didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just stared into the dark and nodded, just once, before heading up the stairs. Daniel sat frozen. He now understood that Evan wasn't just aware of what Daniel knew. He was in control of it. 3 months after Daniel discovered the full scope of Evan's operation, Lisa was found dead at the bottom of the stairs. It happened on a Sunday morning, just as the town was waking up to its usual routines. The police said it was an accident. No signs of forced entry, no bruises that couldn't be explained by the fall, no clear evidence of foul play. Lisa had likely fallen sometime during the night, they said. Maybe she'd gotten up to get water or use the bathroom and lost her footing. Daniel stood at the bottom of the staircase, staring at the indentation on the wall where her head had hit. Blood had pooled at the base, a stark contrast to the soft carpet that usually muffled every step. The wooden banister was loose, one of the screws barely hanging on. When the paramedics arrived, Daniel had already known what they were going to say. He nodded along as they explained the likely sequence of events. He didn't correct them. He didn't tell them that Lisa never walked around at night, not without her slippers, not without her robe, and certainly not in the dark. Evan had an alibi. He wasn't home. He'd spent the weekend at a friend's place 2 towns over, something Lisa had encouraged. She'd even helped him pack his bag. Daniel remembered her telling him how proud she was that Evan was starting to be more social again. Now she was gone. The house became unnervingly quiet. Lisa's presence had always been the glue that held everything together, softening the edge between Daniel and Evan. Without her, something fragile broke. The funeral was simple. She was cremated as she had requested, her ashes placed in a brass urn that Daniel kept on the mantel. Neighbors brought casseroles and condolences. Evan stood beside Daniel, silent and composed, shaking hands, thanking people, his face unreadable. Daniel tried to grieve, but something held him back. He couldn't not get the image out of his mind. The one photo frame that had sat at the top of the stairs was missing. It was a picture of Lisa and her late husband, taken years ago during a family vacation. Later that day, Daniel found the frame in the outside garbage bin, cracked and twisted, as if someone had stepped on it deliberately before throwing it away. Why would Lisa have taken that photo off the wall? And why would she throw it out the night she died? He returned to the stairs again and again, trying to see it from different angles. The railing looked as though it had been loosened intentionally. Not ripped off in a fall, just unstable enough that someone could lose their balance if they leaned too hard. The screw wasn't stripped. It had been unscrewed, half a turn too many. And there were shoe prints on the steps, not hers. The pattern didn't match the slippers Lisa wore every night. Daniel checked them in the closet. Still there, still clean. So if she'd been barefoot, why weren't her prints on the wood? He said nothing. Daniel had already erased too much to go back now. If he accused Evan, he'd have to explain what he knew, how long he'd known it, what he'd done with the evidence. He would become part of the story, and not in the way a grieving husband should be. The guilt twisted inside him like wire. He thought about going to the police anonymously, but even that felt useless. Evan would find out. Evan always found out. In the days after Lisa's death, Evan changed. He wasn't grieving, he wasn't sad. If anything, he seemed lighter. He started eating better, sleeping more. He even cleaned out Lisa's closet, packing up her clothes and donating them without being asked. When Daniel walked in on him sealing the last box, Evan simply looked up and said it was what she would have wanted. Daniel started drinking after that, quietly, at night, just enough to take the edge off. He began locking his bedroom door. He changed his computer passwords. He checked the locks on the windows twice before bed. Paranoia became a part of his daily routine, but he never confronted Evan. There was nothing to gain. There were no witnesses, no proof. Just a quiet understanding between the two of them that now, even Lisa was gone. The silence that followed her death wasn't natural. It was thick, heavy. The house itself felt colder, like something essential had been removed. Daniel caught Evan watching him sometimes, not with malice, but with calculation, like a person measuring the distance between moves in a game only one of them knew they were playing. Daniel wondered if Lisa had seen it too. Just too late to do anything. Now, it was just the two of them. And Daniel knew Evan had eliminated the only person who might have stood in his way. The weeks following Lisa's death slipped by like fog, slow and impenetrable. Daniel continued to live in the same house, follow the same daily rituals, and walk the same silent halls, that now echoed only with memory. He went to work, he paid the bills, he watered Lisa's flowers even though most had begun to wilt. But nothing felt real. Grief had given way to numbness, and beneath it all simmered a fear he couldn't shake. Evan, on the other hand, seemed to thrive in the absence. He moved through the house like he owned it now, sleeping late, hosting friends without asking, taking calls at odd hours in hushed tones. Sometimes he'd disappear for an entire day and return with new clothes or electronics, always brushed off as gifts or returns from friends. Daniel stopped asking. He knew what was happening, even if he didn't want to say it out loud. But everything changed the day Daniel came home early from work. It was a Thursday. He'd left the office with a migraine and intended to lie down for a few hours. The moment he stepped through the front door, something felt wrong. The house was too quiet, even for the afternoon. Evan's car was in the driveway, but there was no sign of him inside. Daniel moved carefully, listening. Then he heard it. Voices. Not in the living room, not upstairs, but in the basement. He crept to the basement door and eased it open just enough to hear. The voices were muffled, but not unfamiliar. One of them belonged to Evan. The other was deeper, older. Daniel couldn't make out everything, but he heard numbers, names, and a phrase that made his stomach drop. "The account's been flagged. We need to shift everything now." A few moments later, the basement door opened and footsteps approached. Daniel ducked into the hallway and hid behind the staircase, heart pounding. A man he didn't recognize passed by, mid-30s, shaved head, tattoos up his neck. He didn't even glance around as he left through the front door. Daniel waited another minute, then walked back toward the basement. Evan stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at him with a look that could have frozen water. Neither spoke. Evan didn't explain. He didn't apologize. He just went into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and walked upstairs like nothing had happened. But from that day on, something unspoken hung between them. The line had been crossed. Evan was no longer pretending to be a college kid with a side hustle. He had revealed something raw and unfiltered. Daniel had seen it. Daniel began documenting everything. Dates, names, phone numbers he overheard, the timestamps of visitors. He took photos of license plates, recorded audio through the floor vents using an old phone. He wasn't sure what he'd do with the information, but it felt like reclaiming control, even a small measure of it. One night, Daniel followed Evan. It was reckless, but he couldn't help it. Evan had left the house around 10 p.m., backpack slung over his shoulder. Daniel waited a few minutes, then slipped into his car and tailed him from a distance. Evan drove across town to a small industrial park. Daniel parked at the edge of the lot and watched from the shadows. Evan met with the same tattooed man from before and another younger guy. The three of them carried boxes into a small warehouse unit and disappeared inside for nearly an hour. When they emerged, Evan was smiling. Daniel knew then that this wasn't just online fraud anymore. Whatever Evan had built, it was expanding. More people, more locations, more risk. And Daniel? He was the only one who knew all of it. The one person who could unravel the whole operation. Which meant he wasn't just an observer anymore. He was a threat. That night, he made a copy of everything he'd gathered. Photos, recordings, notes. He saved them to a USB drive and hid it behind the water heater in the garage. He made another copy and buried it in a Ziploc bag in the backyard under the bird feeder. It wasn't much protection, but it was something. He started sleeping with a golf club next to the bed. Then, things got worse. Daniel's bank account was locked without warning. His credit card was declined at the grocery store. When he called the bank, they said there had been suspicious activity and that someone had attempted to open a line of credit in his name. His email was compromised. Then his work computer flagged for malware. Even his phone began acting strangely, calls dropping, texts disappearing. He didn't have to guess who was behind it. Evan was sending a message, "You're not in control anymore." Daniel felt the walls closing in. He couldn't go to the police without risking everything. If Evan had planted digital evidence to frame him, or worse, wiped Daniel's real evidence, it would be his word against a young man with no criminal record and a perfectly curated image. Who would they believe? The grieving stepfather with no proof, or the clean-cut student with charm and crocodile tears? Daniel knew it was only a matter of time before Evan made his next move. And this time, it wouldn't be subtle. It happened just after midnight on a Monday. Rain hit the windows in rhythmic taps, and the wind creaked through the siding like it had something to say. Daniel was lying in bed, fully dressed, golf club within reach. He hadn't really slept in days, just closed his eyes and waited for whatever came next. Every sound in the house was sharper now, every creak or thud a possible sign that Evan was moving, planning, getting closer to finishing whatever it was he had started. But this time, the noise wasn't subtle. There was a loud crash from downstairs, a door slammed, then footsteps, fast, uneven. Daniel sat up straight, grabbed the club, and moved silently into the hallway. The lights flickered once, then returned to normal. He held his breath and listened. More movement. Someone was in the kitchen. He could hear drawers being opened and shut in a frantic pattern. He crept down the stairs, keeping to the side so the steps wouldn't creak. From the bottom, he could just barely see Evan crouched by the counter, typing something into a tablet, surrounded by opened envelopes, IDs, and a portable scanner. There were receipts scattered everywhere. Something about it was different, rushed, panicked. Evan didn't notice Daniel until it was too late. He turned sharply, eyes wild, as if expecting someone else. Daniel didn't raise the club. He just stood there, waiting. The tension between them thickened like smoke. Finally, Evan broke the silence. "I need to wipe everything. Now," he muttered, more to himself than to Daniel. "They're watching. They traced a login. I think they're coming." Daniel didn't move. He tried to process what Evan was saying. Someone else, someone even more dangerous, was involved. This wasn't just fraud anymore. It was a network, and Evan was no longer in control. He was running. Suddenly, headlights flooded the living room. A car had pulled into the driveway. Then another. Daniel moved to the window. 2 black SUVs. No logos, no sirens. But they didn't need them. He knew. Government, maybe federal, or worse. Private security hired by whoever Evan had crossed. The front door rattled once, then again. Daniel backed away slowly, but Evan didn't move. He just stared at the tablet like it was the only thing that mattered. A loud bang. Then the door burst open. Voices shouted commands, but they weren't police. No badges, no uniforms, just dark clothes, radios, and rifles. 2 men pinned Daniel to the floor while another group swarmed the kitchen. Evan didn't resist. He stood with his hands up, expression blank, like he'd rehearsed this 100 times. In the chaos, Daniel shouted one thing. "Check the garage!" They ignored him. It wasn't until he repeated it, yelled it, that one of the men looked up. "What did he say?" someone asked. "He's hiding backups," Daniel said. "In the garage, behind the water heater. I saw it." That changed something. Two men peeled off and went outside. A few minutes later, they returned with the USB drive, sealed in a plastic evidence bag. The mood shifted. Daniel was released. One of the men, older and clearly in charge, pulled him aside and asked a single question. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Daniel didn't answer. Evan was led out in handcuffs, eyes fixed on Daniel the entire time. There was no anger in them, just something cold and unreadable, like he still believed this wasn't over. As the SUVs pulled away, Daniel stood in the rain, heart pounding in his ears, barely able to breathe. The following days were a blur. Agents came and went. Daniel was questioned for hours. They told him Evan had been part of a cybercrime ring involving data trafficking, identity theft, and black market financial transfers. The operation extended across multiple states, and Evan, barely 19, had been a central hub. They had been monitoring him for months, waiting to see how far the corruption reached. What they hadn't expected was Daniel. The evidence he'd collected filled gaps in their investigation they hadn't even known existed. His notes, recordings, and especially the USB drive proved that Evan had gone rogue. He wasn't just a cog in the machine. He was trying to build his own. That made him dangerous. Eventually, Daniel was cleared of involvement. No charges, just a quiet agreement to keep everything off the record. They called it cooperation, but it felt more like being erased. No one wanted a public trial, too many moving parts, too much risk. The house was quiet again, but not in the same way. Lisa was gone. Evan was gone. Daniel stood in the backyard one evening, staring at the patch of dirt where the second USB drive was still buried. He never dug it up. Maybe he wanted to forget. Maybe he wanted a reminder. He never spoke of Evan again. But some nights, when the wind came through the trees just right, and the silence in the house was too complete, Daniel would check the locks twice, just in case.